Imagine an airline on the edge of collapse, teetering between survival and complete shutdown, where billions of dollars, thousands of jobs, and millions of passengers' plans hang in the balance. Spirit Airlines, the ultra-low-cost carrier that changed the way America flies, is now staring down its most dangerous month yet. Creditors hold the power to decide its fate. Pilots are begging for survival, and the entire industry is holding its breath. What happens next could reshape low-cost travel forever, and it could happen this month. Stay tuned, because the story unfolding here is not just business. It's a high-stakes thriller in the skies. When we talk about Spirit Airlines today, we are not discussing an abstract business challenge. We are staring down the barrel of one of the most acute financial stress tests in U.S. aviation history. The airline's current condition is the result of a decade-long erosion of profitability, failed strategic options, and mounting structural liabilities, culminating in repeated filings for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and intensifying questions about its viability as a going concern. Spirit's struggle is more than a cyclical downturn. It is a systemic crisis rooted in deep financial weakness. In 2025 alone, the airline reported staggering losses, a net loss of more than $317 million in the third quarter, as revenue failed to keep pace with ballooning operating costs. Spirit's operating expenses have outstripped revenue to such an extent that its operating margin only modestly improved from the prior year, but remained deeply negative. These losses did not emerge overnight. Spirit's flight toward distress began with a failed merger attempt that could have provided a strategic lifeline. In early 2024, a proposed merger was blocked on antitrust grounds, depriving the airline of much-needed capital and competitive scale. That collapse sent its stock plummeting and left the company to fend for itself in an overcapacity market, crowded with stronger competitors. The airline's subsequent efforts to restructure through bankruptcy showed early promise, with debt equitization deals and equity infusions securing a temporary runway. For a moment, Spirit emerged as though reborn, but the underlying economics remained tenuous. After initially exiting Chapter 11, liquidity pressures returned swiftly, prompting a second bankruptcy filing in August 2025. That sequence, 2 Chapter 11 cases in less than a year, is a stark indicator of how severe and persistent the airline's distress has become. At the heart of the matter is Spirit's liquidity crunch and creditor calculus. To continue operations, the airline has had to secure successive rounds of debtor-in-possession financing, most notably up to $475 million in staged credit facilities approved by a bankruptcy court. But this financing is not unconditional. It is contingent upon meeting stringent milestones tied to restructuring progress or strategic transactions. Without continued capital support from creditors, Spirit's runway shortens rapidly. Complementing the capital squeeze is a workforce under strain. Pilots and other unionized employees have already agreed to concessions, temporary pay cuts, and reduced benefits to ease operating costs and bolster the airline's prospects of securing additional financing. These concessions, while crucial, illustrate how deeply Spirit's business model has had to be re-engineered just to buy time. The cumulative effect of these pressures is this: Spirit is not merely reorganizing, it is fighting for its financial life. Its ability to remain a going concern depends on continued creditor support, successful execution of its restructuring plan, and, fundamentally, a sustainable business model that can operate profitably in a fiercely competitive and cost-intensive industry. If any of these pillars falter, the risk of an abrupt operational shutdown, once unthinkable for a major U.S. carrier, becomes real. This is the landscape we must understand when we ask, could Spirit Airlines go bust soon? The answer hinges not on optimism, but on cold financial calculus, and the coming weeks will determine whether theory becomes reality. The critical fulcrum in Spirit Airlines' latest existential test does not lie in the hangars of Fort Lauderdale or the cockpits of its Airbus fleet. It lies in one place no airline ever truly controls: the willingness of creditors to continue extending capital. Spirit is no longer a typical company navigating cyclical ups and downs. 2 Chapter 11. Restructurings in less than a year have transformed it into an entity whose survival depends almost entirely on others' conviction that there is a viable economic path forward. In the end, the bondholders hold the keys to Spirit's destiny. In the latest chapter of this high-stakes drama, Spirit secured access to an additional tranche of financing, a lifeline totaling about $100 million, but crucially, only half of that cash was made immediately available. The remainder is conditional, dependent on demonstrable progress toward a credible standalone reorganization plan or a strategic transaction of sufficient value. That conditional structure reveals everything about Spirit's current position. Creditors are no longer writing blank checks. They want proof of forward motion, not just rhetoric about recovery. This isn't mere bureaucratic caution. It is a financial imperative. Lenders evaluate their risk with cold efficiency, and they can, at any point, decide that enough is enough. The debtor-in-possession financing that was once provided as a temporary cushion now demands strict performance criteria. If those criteria aren't met, funding dries up. For Spirit, that would be near instant death. This reality has sparked extraordinary actions. Pilots and flight attendants have taken unprecedented pay concessions, approximately $100 million in labor cost savings, to satisfy restructuring requirements and reassure lenders that Spirit's cost structure can be meaningfully reduced. These concessions are not symbolic gestures. They are strategic moves aimed at unlocking future financing tranches. But even these significant sacrifices do not guarantee continued support from the financial backers whose decisions now dictate the airline's fate. The pilots' union itself recognized this when it issued an open letter to major creditors, pleading not for sentiment but for the economic rationale to keep funding the airline rather than allowing liquidation. This letter was less a rallying cry for morale and more a stark acknowledgement of the real power dynamic in play. Creditors can pull the plug at any moment if they conclude Spirit's restructuring isn't viable. Experts outside Spirit have noted that bondholders do not prioritize employment levels or regional economic impact. They prioritize the likelihood of recovering their investment. That means Spirit must present a credible, data-backed restructuring plan with clear milestones and financial projectio that assure lenders their risk is diminishing, not escalating. Without that assurance, lenders will stop extending capital and Spirit would quickly face operational shutdown or liquidation. Even as Spirit negotiates with creditors, its management has rejected several merger proposals from rivals, electing instead to pursue a standalone reorganization. That decision underscores the intense belief internally that Spirit can fix itself. But creditors are not committed to that belief. They are committed to results. The next infusion of cash is not a given, it is a choice, and creditors must decide whether Spirit's turnaround plan is credible enough to justify continued investment or whether the clock has run out and the airline should be liquidated instead. In this environment, a company's fate is dictated not by rhetoric, but by cold financial calculus. And the question today is simple: will the bondholders continue to fund Spirit's future? Or will they decide that enough loans have been made to an enterprise whose path to profitability remains uncertain? That decision may come sooner rather than later. Spirit Airlines' current battle is not merely a matter of whether it can reorganize its operations. It is the very question of whether the company can survive as a standalone airline at all. Behind the headlines and bankruptcy filings lies an even more profound and pressing struggle: the fight between continuing a complex restructuring plan and sliding into outright liquidation. What separates these two paths is not emotion, not sentiment, and not corporate pride. It is cold, structural viability and cash flow reality. In essence, Spirit's fate hinges on whether its plan to emerge renewed and leaner can realistically satisfy the stringent standards of creditors and courts, or whether the alternative, liquidation and abrupt shutdown, becomes the only financially defensible outcome. Despite emerging from its first Chapter 11 process in early 2025, with significant debt equitized and a reduced balance sheet, Spirit's financial runway quickly eroded due to persistent losses, weak domestic demand, and the structural difficulties of operating in a highly competitive U.S. airline industry. Estimates show Spirit could incur losses approaching nearly $800 million in 2025, and further losses in 2026 before even approaching profitability around 2027. A projection based on management's own outlook. These projections expose the stark reality. Even when emerging from bankruptcy once, profit remains distant and elusive. In response to this unrelenting pressure, Spirit has launched what it calls a comprehensive restructuring process. This process involves strict cost reduction initiatives, renegotiation of aircraft leases, potential asset sales, and a plan to right-size its network and fleet to pull its cost structure back into a viable zone. The company has also secured substantial debtor-in-possession financing facilities totaling hundreds of millions of dollars to give itself room to continue operations while pursuing transformation. Yet these strategic moves, while necessary for survival, are not guarantees of long-term viability. They are design elements of a restructuring blueprint that must convince two crucial audiences: bankruptcy courts and capital providers. The former must be satisfied that the revised plan offers a legitimate path out of bankruptcy, while the latter must believe they will receive sufficient value for their money. If either audience concludes that Spirit's plan is structurally insufficient, if progress stalls, revenue targets are missed, or losses continue without credible turnaround indicators, the calculus rapidly tilts toward liquidation as the default economic choice. The stakes of this choice are enormous and sharply binary. A successful restructuring would allow Spirit to continue flights, preserve a significant number of jobs, and maintain its presence in markets where low-fare service has expanded access to travel. It would demonstrate that with disciplined cost controls and strategic realignment, even a debt-burdened legacy can find a future. Conversely, a failed restructuring, one that fails to meet metrics or loses creditor support, could trigger a sudden cessation of operations with routes shuttered, crews furloughed, and millions in ticket revenue lost overnight. This is not a speculative concern. Industry observers and even rival airlines are reportedly preparing content agency plans for Spirit's potential shutdown, indicating that markets are treating liquidation as a real rather than hypothetical scenario. That preparation alone underscores the gravity of the situation. Spirit's survival is no longer a question of optimism or brand recognition, but whether economic viability can be demonstrated in measurable terms in the coming weeks and months. In this environment, restructuring is not just a legal framework. It is the final battleground between two very different futures for Spirit Airlines. One path leads to a reimagined, leaner airline capable of competing in a tough market. The other leads to liquidation, a corporate collapse with ripple effects across employees, passengers, and the broader aviation ecosystem. The outcome will be decided not by marketing slogans or fare wars, but by whether Spirit's restructuring plan can withstand the unforgiving scrutiny of financial reality. Spirit's internal pressure points are no longer whispers in the boardroom. They have become public, urgent, and stark signals of how tenuous the airline's future has become. At the core of this pressure is not marketing spin or external chatter. It is those on the front lines of flight operations raising their voices in desperation because the runway for survival is shrinking fast. Pilots, flight attendants, and labor groups are no longer content with internal briefings. They are taking their concerns directly to the creditors, whose decisions will determine whether Spirit continues to fly or collapses. In a rare and dramatic move, pilots represented by their union delivered an open letter to major bondholders, imploring them to continue financing the airline's Chapter 11 restructuring, a letter that underscores both the gravity of the situation and the lack of confidence behind the scenes. This appeal was not a motivational memo or a morale-boosting communique. It was a high-stakes plea from workers whose livelihoods, pensions, and careers hang in the balance. The pilot's message framed the choice in blunt terms. Creditors must either continue funding the airline's emergence from bankruptcy or withhold further support, and effectively trigger a liquidation that would shutter thousands of jobs and leave a void in the South Florida economy. The fact that pilots felt compelled to issue such a letter, naming bondholders as the fulcrum of Spirit's fate, reveals how deeply concerns have penetrated beyond management and into the ranks of those whose daily work is operating the flights themselves. This is not an abstract human interest story. It is a clarion trumpet blast about systemic instability. Employee concessions have already been made. Labor groups have accepted substantial contractual changes, including pay cuts and benefits adjustments, designed specifically to unlock the next waves of restructuring funding and reassure creditors about reducing labor costs. These concessions are quantifiable: pilots and flight attendants agreed to roughly $100 million in annual savings as part of revised labor agreements, actions that are only possible because workers are betting their future on a successful turnaround. Yet even these sacrifices have not dampened the stark reality that Spirit's future remains wholly contingent upon continued external funding. The union's open letter names that reality bluntly: creditors have the power to allow continued restructuring or force liquidation, a binary choice with seismic consequences for the workforce and the broader community. The psychological pressure of this moment cannot be overstated. These are not calls for minor course corrections, but rather appeals at the edge of economic survival. A veteran airline pilot observing Spirit's situation even described the union's appeal as reminiscent of last-ditch warnings that preceded other airline failures, suggesting that such public pleas often come when behind-the-scenes confidence is already waning. Beyond labor appeals, Spirit's restructuring actions, furloughs, route cuts, fleet reductions, have rippled through the company, reshaping its operational landscape. Hundreds of pilots have already been furloughed or demoted, signaling deep capability cuts, while the airline continually adjusts staffing to match its shrinking flight schedules. These operational contractions are not isolated human resource decisions. They are structural adjustments reflecting the intense pressure of managing a business whose cost, base, and revenue prospects have been decimated. Against this backdrop, the internal pressures within Spirit are not merely about saving costs or trimming schedules. They are about holding together a workforce willing to bet billions of dollars on their own future. When labor becomes part of the message to creditors, it is a stark indicator that morale, confidence, and economic viability are all in play, and none can be taken for granted. The potential failure of Spirit Airlines extends far beyond its own balance sheet. This is not merely a corporate story about one struggling airline. It is a systemic shock to the low-cost segment of the U.S. aviation market, and its consequences ripple outward to employees, competitors, passengers, and the broader economy. Spirit's network, covering hundreds of domestic and international routes, has long served as the backbone for affordable travel in underserved markets. Should Spirit falter, those routes will not merely vanish. Capacity will shrink, ticket prices will rise, and competitors will scramble to fill the void, often leaving smaller cities and secondary airports with reduced access to low-fare air travel. The implications for competitors are immediate and profound. Carriers that rely on Spirit to maintain competitive pricing may find themselves suddenly able to raise fares, altering market dynamics in ways that have long-term consequences for travel affordability. At the same time, larger airlines will face strategic scions to expand aggressively into former Spirit routes, to absorb new operational burdens, or to remain cautious and leave gaps in service that could frustrate passengers. These choices are not theoretical. Analysts have already flagged the potential for significant revenue shifts and market concentration if Spirit were to cease operations. Employees, too, bear the brunt of systemic uncertainty. Thousands of pilots, flight attendants, ground staff, and administrative personnel face the real possibility of furloughs or permanent job loss. Even if Spirit were to survive, the repeated cycles of bankruptcy and restructuring have already eroded morale and trust, creating operational strain and affecting retention. The workforce is the engine of the airline. When confidence collapses, so too does execution, impacting everything from on-time departures to customer service quality. From a financial perspective, the bankruptcy proceedings have also sent ripples through the capital markets. Spirit's debt obligations, bankruptcy filings, and dependence on creditor financing have drawn attention from investors across the airline sector. Bondholders, equity investors, and even competitors' financial analysts are closely monitoring how creditors respond to Spirit's restructuring milestones, aware that the outcome could set a precedent for other leveraged carriers operating in distressed markets. A failure or successful restructuring will not only impact Spirit, but also influence lender confidence, interest rates on aviation debt, and capital availability across the industry. Even passengers are caught in this high-stakes game. Many have purchased tickets in good faith, relying on Spirit's route network to maintain travel plans. Liquidation could leave millions of travelers stranded or forced to pay higher fares for alternative airlines, creating widespread disruption in the short term and shaking consumer confidence in low-cost carriers over the long term. Viewfromthewing.com. In sum, Spirit Airlines' potential collapse is not contained within its own financial statements. It represents a structural stress test for the U.S. aviation ecosystem, touching labor, consumer access, market pricing, and investor confidence. Each stakeholder, from pilots and passengers to creditors and competitors, must confront the reality that the coming weeks are decisive. The airline's fate, whether recovery or liquidation, will leave lasting consequences on the broader market, reshaping competitive dynamics and redefining the accessibility of air travel in America for years to come. And now, the moment of truth is closer than ever. Will Spirit Airlines rise from the ashes, leaner, stronger, and ready to dominate the skies once again? Or will creditors pull the plug, leaving grounded planes, shattered jobs, and a void in low-cost travel that could change the U.S. aviation market forever? The clock is ticking, every decision matters, and the fate of millions is hanging by a thread. 1 month, one decision, one outcome, and the skies may never look the same. Stay alert, because what happens next isn't just news, it's history in the making.